Imagine being strapped into a cockpit at 30,000 feet, the roar of jet engines behind you, the earth a distant blur below. You are invincible, you are trained, you are the best of the best, and then in a single heartbeat everything changes. A missile screams from nowhere. Your aircraft shudders, spins, and breaks apart around you. You pull the ejection handle. You float down through enemy sky, and when your boots finally touch the ground, you realize the worst is not over. The worst has only just begun. This is not fiction. This is not Hollywood. This happened to real men, real pilots, men who flew for freedom and landed in hell, and today we are going to hear their stories. Stories that have never left the hearts of those who lived them. Stories of broken bones and unbroken spirits. Stories of solitary confinement, brutal interrogation, starvation, and the kind of psychological torture that can shatter a man from the inside out. But more than anything, these are stories of survival. Of courage so raw and so real that it defies everything you think you know about the limits of the human spirit. Stay with me for the next 60 minutes because what you are about to hear will change the way you look at freedom forever. Let us go back. Back to a time when the skies over Vietnam, Korea, and the deserts of Iraq were the most dangerous places on Earth for an American pilot. Back to a time when being shot down did not mean the mission was over. It meant the real mission had just begun. The mission of staying alive. The mission of resisting. The mission of coming home. To understand what these men endured, you have to understand who they were before the war found them. They were not ordinary men who stumbled into extraordinary circumstances. They were selected, trained, and shaped by the most rigorous military aviation programs in the world. These were men who had passed tests that broke others. Men who had climbed inside machines of war and learned to make those machines extensions of their own will. They were disciplined. They were focused. They were confident in a way that only comes from knowing you have already survived things that would destroy most people. And yet none of that training, none of that confidence, none of that discipline could fully prepare them for what waited on the other side of that ejection. James Stockdale was one such man. A Navy pilot, yes, but his story belongs to the larger brotherhood of aviators who fell from the sky over enemy territory. On September 9, 1965, Stockdale's A-4 Skyhawk was hit by anti-aircraft fire over North Vietnam. He ejected. He landed in a small village. Within minutes, he was surrounded. Within hours, he was in the hands of the North Vietnamese military. And for the next 7.5 years, he would live inside the walls of the Ho Lo prison, a place American pilots would come to call the Hanoi Hilton. 7.5 years. Think about that. Think about where you were 7.5 years ago. Think about everything that happened in your life in that time. Now imagine spending every single one of those days inside a stone cell, often alone, often in darkness, often in pain. Stockdale did not just survive those years, he led. Even as a prisoner, even in chains, he organized his fellow prisoners into a resistance structure. He created a code, a tap code that allowed prisoners to communicate through the walls. He gave them rules to live by, a framework for dignity inside a place designed to strip them of everything. He told his men, "We are going to come out of this with our honor intact," and they did. In 1973, when Stockdale walked off that plane in the United States, he was broken in body but undefeated in soul. He would later receive the Medal of Honor, but the medal was never the point. The point was what he had chosen to be in the dark when no one was watching, when there was no guarantee he would ever see daylight again. But let us not move too fast, because to truly understand what these men faced, we need to sit inside those prison walls for a moment. We need to feel what they felt. The Hanoi Hilton was built by the French in the late 1800s to house Vietnamese political prisoners. The irony of American pilots being held there was not lost on anyone. The walls were thick, the cells were small. The heat in summer was suffocating, the cold in winter cut to the bone. Prisoners were fed a thin soup and scraps of bread. They were given a bucket for a toilet. They were allowed to bathe infrequently. They slept on concrete slabs. And that was on the good days. On the bad days, the guards would come. Interrogations were conducted with a simple, brutal goal: to extract information, to get confessions, to produce propaganda. The methods used were not subtle. Prisoners were bound with ropes in stress positions that cut off circulation and caused excruciating pain. They were kept awake for days at a time. They were beaten. They were isolated. They were told that their country had forgotten them, that their families had moved on, that they were never coming home. The psychological dimension of this torture was just as devastating as the physical, because the body can heal, but the mind can be turned against you in ways that are very hard to come back from. Jeremiah Denton was another man who understood this with a clarity that most of us will never have to find. Shot down in 1965, Denton spent nearly 8 years as a prisoner of war. During a televised interview that the North Vietnamese staged as propaganda, Denton did something extraordinary. He blinked. That sounds simple. That sounds almost insignificant. But Jeremiah Denton blinked in Morse code. While the cameras rolled, while he answered his captors' questions, while the whole world watched what was supposed to be proof that American prisoners were treated well, Denton spelled out a single word with his eyelids. Torture. It was the first confirmation that American prisoners of war were being tortured. It was an act of courage so precise, so calculated, so brave, that it belongs alongside any act of battlefield heroism ever recorded. Denton later said that he was terrified the entire time, that he had no idea if his blinking would be noticed, no idea if it would cost him his life, but he did it anyway, because that is what you do when you are a man of honor inside a place that has no honor. Robinson Rissner was another name that echoed through those prison walls like a battle cry. Rissner was a Korean War ace, a man who had already proven himself in aerial combat before he ever set foot in Vietnam. Shot down in 1965, he would spend over 7 years as a prisoner. Rissner became a symbol not just for American pilots but for the entire POW community. His face appeared on the cover of Time magazine before he was captured, and the North Vietnamese knew exactly who they had. They gave him special attention. They isolated him repeatedly. They subjected him to particularly harsh treatment precisely because they understood that breaking Rissner would break the spirit of every man who looked up to him. They never broke him. Rissner would later write about the moments when he came closest to the edge, when the pain was so overwhelming that surrender seemed like the only option left. He would press his face against the crack at the bottom of his cell door and breathe the outside air. He would pray. He would count. He would do anything to stay inside himself, to keep the part of him that was still free from being taken. He always pulled back from the edge, every single time. Now let us talk about something that is often overlooked in the conventional telling of these stories. Let us talk about time. What does time do to a man in isolation? Psychologists who have studied prolonged solitary confinement describe it as one of the most destructive experiences a human being can undergo. The human mind is built for connection. It is built for stimulation, for purpose, for the rhythm of days that mean something. Take all of that away and the mind begins to turn on itself. Prisoners reported hearing sounds that were not there. They reported conversations with people who were not present. They built entire worlds inside their heads just to have somewhere to go. Some men composed symphonies in their minds. Some men built houses nail by nail, board by board in their imagination. Some men replayed every memory they had ever stored, cataloging their lives like libraries, just to have something to hold on to. Larry Chesley, who was held prisoner for nearly 8 years, taught himself an entire course in Spanish inside his head. John McCain, shot down in 1967, recited the names of every person he had ever known to keep his memory alive and his mind sharp. These were not just coping mechanisms. They were acts of profound psychological resistance. They were ways of saying, you can have my body, but you cannot have my mind. John McCain's story deserves its own chapter inside any telling of this history. McCain was the son of an admiral, a fact that the North Vietnamese quickly discovered and immediately tried to exploit. They offered him early release. They told him he could go home, and he said no. He said no because the code among American prisoners was clear: first in, first out. You did not accept special treatment. You did not leave your brothers behind. You went home in the order you arrived, or you did not go home at all. McCain refused early release while his bones were still broken from the crash that brought him down over Hanoi's Truc Bac Lake. He refused while he was recovering from injuries so severe that they would affect him physically for the rest of his life. He refused because he understood that some things matter more than your own comfort, more than your own freedom, and in that moment more than your own survival. The North Vietnamese were furious. They subjected him to particularly brutal treatment in the months that followed. He was beaten regularly. He was kept in isolation. He was put in a cell so small he could barely move, and still he did not break. When he was finally released in 1973 as part of Operation Homecoming, he had spent 5.5 years as a prisoner. He walked back into American life with a body that bore the permanent marks of what he had endured and a spirit that had not been touched. Let us pause here, because it would be easy listening to these stories to begin to think that these men were somehow superhuman, that they were made of different material than the rest of us, but they were not. They were human beings with the same fears and doubts and breaking points that any of us have. The difference was not that they did not feel those things. The difference was what they chose to do with those feelings. Almost every survivor of prolonged captivity has spoken about the moments when they wanted to give up. The moments when the pain was too great, when the isolation was too complete, when the future seemed too uncertain to be worth fighting for. What kept them going was not the absence of despair. It was the choice made over and over again to resist despair, to refuse it, to say, not today, you do not get me today, tomorrow I may be weaker, tomorrow I may fall, but not today. The TAP code that Stockdale helped systematize became one of the most important tools of resistance in the entire POW experience. It was not a new invention. Prisoners throughout history have used similar methods to communicate through walls, but in the Hanoi Hilton it became a lifeline. 2 taps, then 3 taps. The letters of the alphabet arranged in a 5x5 grid with C and K sharing a space. Prisoners tapped messages to each other through walls, through floors, through the light taps of a broom handle. They passed information, they told jokes, they shared prayers, they reported on interrogation techniques so that other men could be prepared. The guards tried to stop it. Prisoners were punished when they were caught. But the tapping continued because the connection it provided was not a luxury, it was survival. Knowing that another human being was on the other side of that wall, knowing that you were not utterly alone, knowing that your community still existed even if you could not see it, that knowledge was the difference between holding on and letting go. Fred Cherry was the first Black Air Force officer to be captured in the Vietnam War. Shot down in October 1965, Cherry faced not only the brutality of his captors, but also the additional psychological pressure of racial taunts and attempts by the North Vietnamese to use America's racial tensions as a weapon against him. They told him that Black Americans had no reason to fight for a country that oppressed them. They tried to separate him from his fellow prisoners. They tried to convince him that his loyalty to America was misplaced. Fred Cherry's response to all of this was definitive. He refused to be separated. He refused to be used. He maintained his identity as an American officer, as a military man, as a man of honor, throughout years of captivity that tested him in ways that compounded the standard brutality with layers of additional psychological attack. His story is a testament not only to personal courage, but to the power of choosing who you are going to be when everything in your environment is designed to make that choice impossible. Porter Halliburton was the white Navy pilot who shared a cell with Fred Cherry during some of the most difficult months of Cherry's captivity. Cherry had been severely injured in the crash that brought him down, and for months he was barely able to care for himself. Halliburton nursed him. He cleaned his wounds. He helped him move. He talked to him through the darkest hours. 2 men from very different backgrounds in one of the most desolate places on earth, discovering in each other something that transcended race and background and everything that divided America outside those walls. Their friendship became one of the most remarkable human stories to emerge from the entire POW experience. It is a story about what human beings are capable of when they are stripped of everything except their humanity. The psychological battle was not fought only in isolation. It was also fought in group settings, in the moments when captors brought prisoners together for propaganda purposes, for staged events, for what the North Vietnamese called quiz sessions, a term that was a grotesque understatement for the interrogations they represented. Pilots were brought before cameras. They were told to read statements denouncing the war, denouncing America, expressing gratitude to their captors. Some men complied eventually under pressure so extreme that compliance became the only way to survive. And those men carried the weight of that compliance with them for the rest of their lives. The code of conduct said you were to resist to the best of your ability. It did not say you were to die before you spoke. It acknowledged human limits. And part of the profound moral complexity of the POW experience is the compassion that survivors showed to one another for what each man did or did not do under conditions of extreme duress. Doug Hegdahl was a different kind of story altogether. Hegdahl was not a pilot. He was a Navy seaman who fell overboard from his ship and was captured by the North Vietnamese in 1967. Young, barely 20 years old, seemingly naive, Hegdahl was underestimated by his captors in ways that he used brilliantly against them. He played dumb. He acted confused. He wandered around the camp with what appeared to be childlike curiosity, and in doing so he gathered intelligence that no one thought he was capable of gathering. He memorized the names of 256 fellow prisoners. He memorized them in a song set to the tune of Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Names, shoot-down dates, personal information. He was eventually offered early release, one of the very few prisoners for whom accepting early release was considered not just acceptable but a direct order from the senior prisoner officer because the intelligence he carried in his head needed to get out. When Hegdahl walked off that plane and began to debrief, the information he provided was staggering. He was 22 years old. The Korean War produced its own generation of POW stories that in some ways were even more obscure and in some ways even more extreme. The conditions in North Korean prison camps were different from the Hanoi Hilton but no less brutal. Pilots who were shot down over Korea faced a captivity system that was less organized and in many ways more randomly violent. Food was scarcer. Medical care was virtually non-existent. The death rate among prisoners was staggering. Of the roughly 7,000 Americans who were held as prisoners of war in Korea, nearly 40% did not survive. That number alone should stop you cold. 4 out of every 10 men who entered those camps did not come out alive. The ones who did come out carried stories that America was slow to hear and slower to honor, because Korea was already being called the Forgotten War by the time the prisoners came home. Harold Fisher was an Air Force ace who shot down 10 enemy aircraft over Korea before his own plane was brought down in April 1953. Fisher was held not just in Korea, but was eventually transferred to China, where he was kept for an additional 2 years after the Korean War armistice. He spent more than 4 years as a prisoner in total, and his confinement in China included long periods of solitary isolation and intense ideological pressure. The Chinese called it re-education. They wanted Fisher to confess to using bacteriological warfare, a charge that was false. They wanted him to say that America was the aggressor, that the war was a crime. Fisher resisted for as long as he could. Eventually, under conditions of extreme psychological pressure, he signed a document. It was one of the great controversies of the Korean POW experience: what men signed and what men said, and how much of it was true and how much of it was extracted by force. Fisher came home in 1955, 2 years after the war ended. He spent the rest of his life trying to explain what had happened to him in ways that people who had not been there could understand. The concept of brainwashing entered the American vocabulary largely because of the Korean War POW experience. Americans were disturbed and confused by images of prisoners who seemed to denounce their country sincerely, who seemed to have been genuinely converted to the enemy's ideology. Studies conducted after the war found a more complicated picture. Most men had not been genuinely converted. Most had simply been subjected to techniques of psychological pressure so sustained and so sophisticated that their ability to resist had been worn down to nothing. They had not been brainwashed in the science fiction sense of the word. They had been broken by human methods, by isolation and exhaustion and pain and manipulation, and the basic human need to be recognized as a person by the people around you, even if those people are your captors. Understanding this does not diminish the courage of those who resisted. It deepens our understanding of what resistance actually costs. The Air Force and the military as a whole took the lessons of Korea seriously in ways that shaped how they prepared the next generation of pilots for the possibility of captivity. The Code of Conduct was formalized in 1955, just 2 years after the Korean War ended. It gave prisoners a framework, a set of principles to hold on to when everything else was being taken away. Survive with honor, make no statements disloyal to your country, keep faith with your fellow prisoners, accept no special favors from the enemy, resist with all means available. These principles were not always perfectly followed. They were not meant to be a rigid set of rules that condemned those who failed to achieve them. They were meant to be a beacon. Direction to face when you were lost in the dark. SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape became a mandatory part of pilot preparation following Korea. Pilots were subjected to controlled versions of the experiences they might face as prisoners: sleep deprivation, stress positions, mock interrogations, isolation. Former POWs have said that SEER training, as hard as it was, did not fully replicate what they experienced in actual captivity. But it gave them a frame of reference. It meant that when they were sitting in a cell in Hanoi or Pyongyang, they had something to connect their experience to. They could say, "I have felt something like this before, I survived it before, I can survive it again." That psychological anchor was worth more than any physical preparation. Let us talk about the Iraq Wars and the pilots who were captured there, because the POW experience did not end with Vietnam. In January 1991, during Operation Desert Storm, a number of coalition pilots were shot down over Iraq and captured by Saddam Hussein's forces. The treatment they received was internationally condemned. Images of bruised and disoriented pilots reading prepared statements on Iraqi television shocked the world. These men were held for weeks, not years, but the intensity of what they experienced in those weeks was severe. Jeffrey Zahn, a Navy pilot whose battered face appeared on television screens around the world, later described what had been done to him to coerce his on-camera statement. The international outcry over the treatment of coalition prisoners during Desert Storm was significant and contributed to the eventual repatriation of all coalition POWs. When the war ended in late February 1991, the 2003 Iraq War produced its own POW drama, most famously in the case of Jessica Lynch, an Army soldier rather than a pilot. But also in the stories of several aviators whose aircraft were brought down in the opening days of the conflict. The story of those pilots reflects both the continuity of the POW experience across decades of American military history and the ways in which that experience had changed. Modern communication technology meant that information traveled faster. The international legal framework around prisoners of war was more developed. But the fundamental human experience of being in enemy hands, of being cut off from your world and placed entirely at the mercy of people who do not regard you with mercy, that experience had not changed. Now let us go deeper into the interior world of captivity, because the physical stories are important. The names and dates and events matter. But what also matters, what perhaps matters most, is what happened inside the minds and souls of these men during the years they spent in darkness. Many of them have spoken about faith. Not all of them were deeply religious men before they were captured. Some of them became deeply religious during captivity. Stockdale was a student of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who himself had been a slave. Epictetus wrote about the dichotomy of control, about the distinction between what is in our power and what is not in our power. Stockdale had read Epictetus before he was shot down. In the years of his captivity, he lived Epictetus. He held onto the idea that while the enemy could control his body, could control his environment, could control virtually everything around him, there was one thing they could absolutely not control: his response to what was happening to him. His inner world, his values, his choices. That philosophical framework became his armor. Others found their armor in simpler things, in the memory of a wife's face, in the thought of a child growing up somewhere across the ocean, in the stubborn refusal to give their captors the satisfaction of seeing them break. Ray Voden, held for over 7 years, said that he survived by deciding every morning that he was going to make it through that day, just that day. He did not think about the years stretching ahead. He did not let himself spiral into the question of whether he would ever go home. He thought about today, making it through today, and then tomorrow morning he made the same decision again. This is, incidentally, a technique that modern trauma psychology validates completely. When the future is too large and too uncertain to face, you make it small. You make it today, you make it this hour. You make it the next 5 minutes if that is all you can manage. The relationships between prisoners, even when they could not see each other, were sustaining in ways that are hard to overstate. The TAP code was more than a communication system, it was a community. Men who had never met face to face knew each other through the rhythms of those taps. They knew who was struggling. They knew who needed encouragement. They sent jokes. They sent prayers. They sent news of new arrivals and news of those who had been moved to other sections of the camp. Mike McGrath, who became one of the most thorough chroniclers of the POW experience, described the TAP code as the glue that held the prisoner community together. Without it, he said, the isolation would have been complete and the damage would have been far worse than it was. With it, even in the worst of the solitary confinement periods, a man knew he was part of something larger than himself. The wives and families of POWs and missing in action pilots deserve their own chapter in this history, and we would be incomplete if we did not at least open that chapter here. Sybil Stockdale, James Stockdale's wife, was one of the founders of the National League of Families of American Prisoners and Missing in Southeast Asia. While her husband was in the Hanoi Hilton, she was in Washington fighting a different battle. She and other military wives pushed, cajoled, lobbied, and demanded that the American government take a more aggressive stance on the treatment of prisoners of war. They broke with the official government position that quiet diplomacy was the best approach, and they went public with the stories of what was happening to their husbands. They organized, they demonstrated, they wrote letters, they met with foreign dignitaries. They kept the issue alive when official Washington would have preferred it to remain quiet. The families of POWs were not passive recipients of grief. They were active, determined, and ultimately effective advocates. The world learned about the torture in the Hanoi Hilton in significant part because women like Sybil Stockdale refused to stay silent. Operation Homecoming in 1973 was the name given to the return of American prisoners of war from Vietnam following the Paris Peace Accords, between February and April of that year. 591 American military personnel were released and returned to the United States. The scenes at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, where the planes first landed, were extraordinary. Grown men who had been trained to maintain composure under any circumstances, wept openly. The ground crews, the medical personnel, the reporters who were there to cover the event, many of them also wept. These men had been gone for years. Some of them had not seen their children since they were infants. Some of them were meeting children for the first time. Some of them had aged so dramatically that their families barely recognized them. Some of them came off those planes with injuries that had never been properly treated, walking with the particular gait of men whose bodies had been broken and had healed badly in the absence of medical care. But the return was not simple. Coming home from years of captivity is its own kind of crisis. The world had changed while these men were gone. America in 1973 was a very different country than America in 1965 or 1966 or 1967 when they had left. The anti-war movement had transformed the culture. The social revolutions of the 1960s had remade family structures and gender roles and the relationship between citizens and their government. Men who had gone to war with one America returned to find a different America waiting for them. And they themselves were different. They had been through something that no amount of briefing or preparation could fully translate to people who had not shared it. They came home to welcome and honor, and in some cases, to confusion and alienation, and the particular loneliness of knowing that the people who loved you most could not quite reach you where you actually were. The mental health dimension of the POW return has been studied extensively in the decades since. Post-traumatic stress was not a term that was widely used in 1973, but the experiences that term describes were very much present in the lives of returning prisoners. Nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty with intimacy, unexpected rage, the sudden inability to tolerate confinement of any kind, even being in an elevator. Some men described not being able to eat without anxiety for months after returning, because the relationship between food and control and captivity had been so thoroughly rewritten during their imprisonment. Others described the disorientation of abundance, the overwhelming sensory experience of a grocery store after years of near-starvation rations, and yet the resilience was equally remarkable. Studies of Vietnam POWs conducted decades after their return found, in many cases, what researchers call post-traumatic growth. Men who had been through the most extreme experiences of captivity had, in significant numbers, come out of those experiences with a clarity of values, a depth of relationships, and a sense of purpose that they themselves attributed directly to what they had survived. They did not romanticize the suffering. They were absolutely clear that what had been done to them was wrong, was brutal, was a violation of everything the Geneva Convention was meant to protect. But they also said that what they had found in those cells, the discovery of what they were made of, the confirmation that they could endure, had given them something they would not trade away. That is not a comfortable thought. It is a true one. Everett Alvarez was the first Navy pilot shot down and captured in Vietnam. Shot down on August 5, 1964, the day after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Alvarez would spend 8.5 years as a prisoner, the longest captivity of any American pilot in the Vietnam War, 8.5 years. He was 26 years old when he was captured. He was 35 when he came home. He lost nearly a decade of his life. He missed marriages, funerals, the birth of children he had only imagined. He came home to find that the woman he had been engaged to had married someone else, a fact that he had been carefully kept from knowing during his captivity. The desolation of that discovery, on top of everything else he had already endured, was an almost incomprehensible blow, and yet Alvarez rebuilt his life. He went back to school. He had a career. He raised a family. He became a symbol not of victimhood, but of possibility. The possibility that a human being can lose nearly everything and still find a way to build something worth having from what remains. As we move toward the conclusion of this journey through some of the most extraordinary stories in American military history, it is worth stepping back and asking what these stories mean for us today, not as historical curiosities, not as distant tales of a world that no longer exists, but as living instructions for living, because the fundamental challenges that these men faced are not unique to the circumstances of war. The challenge of maintaining your identity when your environment is designed to erase it. The challenge of finding community when you are isolated. The challenge of making meaning when everything appears meaningless. The challenge of choosing who you are going to be on the days when being anything at all requires everything you have. These are not just the challenges of the prisoner of war. These are the challenges of being human. The pilots who came home from the Hanoi Hilton and from the camps of Korea and from Iraqi captivity had learned something about themselves that most of us will spend our entire lives trying to understand. They knew what they were made of. They had been tested at the absolute outer limit of human endurance, and they had found that there was something in them that did not break. Not that could not be harmed, not that did not hurt, but that did not ultimately break. That knowledge is the kind that changes a person forever. It creates a bedrock of self-understanding that nothing can shake because it is grounded in the hardest possible evidence. James Stockdale, in the years after his return, became a philosopher as well as a military hero. He lectured, he wrote, he thought deeply about what his experience had meant and what it could teach. He was once asked what kind of men did not make it, not physically but psychologically. Who were the ones who were broken beyond healing? His answer has become famous. He said it was the optimists, not because hope is bad, but because the optimists were the ones who said, "We will be out by Christmas, and And when Christmas came and went, they said, "We will be out by Easter." And when Easter came and went, they said, "We will be out by Thanksgiving." And one by one the dates passed, and the hope that was attached to those dates died with them, and eventually the optimists ran out of dates and broke. What you needed, Stockdale said, was something different from optimism. You needed the faith that you would prevail in the end, combined with the clear-eyed acceptance of the brutal facts of your current situation. You had to hold both of those things at once, the belief in ultimate survival and the honesty about present reality. That combination has come to be known as the Stockdale paradox, and it is taught in leadership programs in business schools and military academies around the world as one of the most powerful frameworks for navigating crisis ever articulated. It was articulated by a man sitting in a stone cell in Hanoi, tapping messages through a wall, refusing to break, choosing every single day to be something that his captors could not take from him. These stories do not belong only to the men who lived them. They belong to all of us. They belong to every person who has ever faced something that seemed unsurvivable. They belong to everyone who has ever sat in their own personal darkness, wondering if there is a way through. The pilots of the Hanoi Hilton, the survivors of the Korean camps, the men who came home from the deserts of Iraq having endured things they still struggle to talk about, they are telling us something. They are telling us that the human spirit is more durable than we know. That community sustains us when isolation tries to destroy us. That meaning can be made from almost anything. That resistance is possible even when it costs everything. That honor is not something that circumstance can take from you. Only you can give it away. The names on those prison walls, tapped out in code through the long nights of captivity, are part of the permanent record of what human beings are capable of at their very best. Stockdale, Denton, Rissner, McCain, Cherry, Alvarez, Hegdahl, Halliburton, Fisher. These men flew into the sky in service of something larger than themselves. When the sky brought them down, they found ways to keep serving. Inside walls, in darkness, in pain, they served, they led, they resisted, and most of them came home. They came home changed. They came home carrying weight that would never fully leave them. But they came home with something else too, something that cannot be given by anyone and cannot be taken by anyone. The knowledge of who they were when everything was on the line. The absolute certainty, purchased at an almost unimaginable price, that they had been given the worst that another human being could deliver and they had not been destroyed by it. Freedom has a price. These men paid it in the most personal, the most intimate, the most devastating way imaginable. They paid it with years of their lives. They paid it with their health. They paid it with relationships that were damaged or lost and never fully recovered. And they paid it with the ongoing work of returning to a life that had moved on without them and finding a way to belong to it again. We owe them more than gratitude. We owe them the effort to understand what they actually went through, to look honestly at the cost of the freedoms we enjoy, and to ask ourselves whether we are living in ways that honor that cost. The next time you look up at the sky and see a jet trail cutting across the blue, remember that somewhere along the arc of American history, men flew in skis like that and did not come home the way they had planned. They came home through fire and darkness and years of suffering that most of us cannot begin to imagine. And most of them came home anyway. Now, here is the question I want to leave with you today, and I want you to think about it seriously. If you were placed in a situation where everything was taken from you, where you were isolated, where you were pressured to abandon your values and your identity, what would you hold on to? What is the thing inside you, the principle, the relationship, the belief that you would refuse to give up no matter what it cost? The pilots of the Hanoi Hilton knew their answers. They had to know. Their survival depended on it. What is yours? If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you look at freedom differently, do one simple thing. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment below with the name of the pilot whose story struck you most. And subscribe if you want more stories like this, stories that go beyond the headlines and into the human heart of history. These stories matter. Help them find the people who need them.